My name is David Bickerstaf. I'm an artist and a filmmaker, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice and the way I go about making documentaries and artist films. I guess I need to start by saying that I didn't go to film school, so I'm very much a self-taught filmmaker. I taught myself how to use the camera. Of course, I come from a fine art background, so I was very used to photography and composition. And so I became very interested in documentary because there was I had a very close relationship with another filmmaker called Phil Grabsky, who is the producer of Exhibition on Screen. And I was particularly interested in maybe looking at documentary and using it, exploring the format a little bit and trying to break through the format. The usual sort of the interview, and then you do a cutaway to what the interviewee is talking about. But I was much more interested in what the visual language could tell you as a piece of documentary filmmaking. So the image becomes quite important. The first documentary I made was a film about Chernobyl. It was called Heavy Water, and it was based on a book of poems by Mario Petrucci. And we had the book of poems, and they were very, very powerful. They created a lot of images in my mind. I'd never been to Chernobyl, so I said to Phil, let's just put the book to one side and let's go as filmmakers with our cameras and just record what's there. Let's look with our own eyes, go and find our own experience. And I think that's important as a filmmaker, to actually go to a location or to go to the places where your subject is very familiar with, because they will talk about it with a particular familiarity, and you need to get a sense of your own place within that structure of their environment, of what they're talking about. So going back to Chernobyl, we went for 1 to 2 weeks. We just filmed everything. We didn't say, oh, that's going to make a great film for this particular poem. We didn't say that at all. We went back to London. We showed the footage to Mario, the poet, and he said, this is amazing. He'd never been to Chernobyl himself. He had written the poems as a reaction to a brilliant book by Svetlana Alexievich, Voices of Chernobyl. And he started to adapt his poetry to make it shorter, make it more succinct, make it more direct. And then we went back a second time or a third time, and we actually decided, we took footage that was a little bit more structured around the concept of the narrative that we were trying to tell. And for me, I thought this was a great experiment and that's very much the way a fine artist would work. You draw, you sketch, you sort of build up your composition, you build up an idea, and then you put it out to the world and you allow other people then to build a construct around it. You don't try and explain it too much, you let the visuals do the talking. And I can't say I know exactly what makes a good documentary on art. I think you've got to get a sense that the person making the film actually really loves the subject and has done a lot of research and has really involved themselves in the subject. And the other thing is that the one thing that I'm not a great fan of seeing in documentaries about art is the director's presence. And I know it's a formula for some documentaries, and sometimes it really works because the director becomes a personality within the structure of the documentary. And then sometimes it's about the director's struggle to understand, and that becomes the person who's viewing the documentary. It becomes their struggle. The director's struggle is their struggle to understand or to see through the art. But I prefer to allow the artwork to actually do the talking and the artist to do the talking, or other artists or other curators or other people to put a context on it, and for me to be a silent observer, and perhaps my only presence within the film is the way that the camera lingers, or the camera moves, or the view is sort of subjective. I don't like to make it, I don't like to impose my opinion too much upon what's going on, but it's very important, and I hope it comes across in my films, that when I'm working on a person or an artist or a genre of art, that I am completely involved in it. It's like doing a little mini thesis. Every time you make a film, you have to do a lot of reading, you have to do a lot of research, you need to understand your subject, and then you've got to make sure that you look after the subject, that you make sure that it has an area of where it can build an understanding and a communication between the audience and itself, without the distraction of too much fancy camera work. You know, you don't want to. The worst thing, I guess, I mean, for me, you know, because I work a lot with fine art, so sort of major artists like Van Gogh, like Michelangelo, you know, these are, you know, Hieronymus Bosch, these are classic artists. You know, you don't want to go necessarily to see a film about them and be all MTV, you know, all very straight, very fast cuts and things. It doesn't somehow, it seems to jar, because the thing that we try to do with our films is to allow the audience time to look at the painting, to almost be mesmerized as it's standing in front of the painting, and then go closer into it and closer into it. And it's, at first you're thinking, wow, this shot's been held for a long time. But in cinema, time is your friend. Time, you really do, you can play with time in cinema. And I find it the most interesting documentaries is when they can find a format to tell the story in a different way without over-imposing the cinematic aesthetic, that you allow the art to come through. I think this is what makes a very interesting arts documentary. It's an interesting question about why young filmmakers should think about making documentaries, and I would say that a lot of young filmmakers, their first the first thought is to make a documentary because it's easier to make. It's much harder to get a cast together, or, you know, and some people are very you know, would prefer to do the theatrical type of filmmaking, and I understand that. But actually, I would suggest that documentary filmmaking is actually a much easier thing to do. You can have a single cameraman, you could be the camera person yourself, you know, all you need to do is to find a really interesting subject. And so a lot of people, when they're making documentaries to begin with, will think of something political or something very socially minded, you know, that's, you know, because documentaries have always been associated with news, or with, you know, storytelling about sort of conflict or other sort of areas. But I think in the arts, there are some amazing and very interesting artists that have great stories to tell. And they tend to, well, first of all, you've got to, as a documentary filmmaker, I guess you've got to like the art form that you're making the film about. So that's why you get a lot of young filmmakers making films about dance, for instance, hip-hop dancing and things like that, because it's close to their own culture, or street art, and things like that. So they tend not to go and do a film about, you know, an elder artist or someone, you know, who's sort of maybe in the mainstream, because perhaps that's not so achievable. But I think it's very valid to go and look for, I mean, if you're going to look for alternative arts, an alternative art scene, it's really young people who have the access to that. Their ear is closer to the ground than, to say, older filmmakers like me. So I think this is where an area that younger people can really exploit. Look to their own times, look to their own culture, look to their own influences, and that's where they have a unique access into making really effective documentaries. And access is key to documentary filmmaking. If you can manage to get access to something unique that no one else has got access to, 50% of your film is already made because you have that access. And then it's up to you with what you do with that access. That's the other 50%. And that comes down to craft. And that comes down to, you know, experience a little bit. Sometimes younger filmmakers over aestheticize the film. They try and do too much. But actually the most effective documentaries are the very simple ones, and that allow the subject to do the work for them. So it's just allowing the camera to be there, to be a presence, and just to capture and observe, rather than the filmmaking process become part of the aesthetic. So anyway, that's my thoughts. I mean, it's a very personal thought, but I think that if I was a young filmmaker now, I'd be looking to my culture, my local culture, to perhaps artistic processes that are very interesting to me, but is also close to me. So if you have friends who are hip-hop dancers or ballet dancers or singers or people who are, you know, great artists, you know, who draw all the time, except they've got no art training, so that might be very interesting as a documentary. And, you know, people who've overcome all sorts of disabilities perhaps, but I think you can combine these things of social comment and also art form. And I think, yeah, that would be my advice to young people, to actually look close to home. Sometimes it's an interesting sort of leap to make art about art. You know, my art form is a filmmaking art form. You, my subject, you make paintings, you know. But it's a very similar process, you know. I always think, because I come from fine art background, I love to do my own editing, because it's the closest thing I see to drawing and composition, creating, you know, tension, sequences and things like that. I find that very interesting. And some filmmakers, they can't get their head around the editing process. They have to have an editor to do that, or they need to find a musician. So I work with the same composer all the time, because I have a relationship, a dialogue with that composer, and we have a methodology of the way we would construct the music for the films. And that's a great dialogue. And I always like to have the music first before I start the editing, because it actually helps me construct the film. It helps me to think about sort of the emotional structure of what I'm trying to do, the narrative structure of what I'm trying to do. And I'm often experimenting with, you know, adjacencies of scenes and of what have you. But if you're paying an editor, the editor will probably follow the script much more. Sure, they can be a bit expressive. A good editor is like that. Can be, you know, suggest, I think this is the way the scene's going to work the best, you know. But for me, I find that the struggle with that is like struggling with a painting. And I find that really, you know, I like that process. It can be torturous, but I really like it, because I'm not a trained editor either. So you're learning all the time. The thing about making the film is that you can just pick up a camera and go and make a film. You know, the hardest part is to get people to look at it and to see it. I always say, you know, even films that have, you know, high production values and have had a bit of money, you've got to get it. The distribution is completely is the thing to get right. And a lot of young people these days have been very, very clever with YouTube, with Vimeo, with these sort of platforms and getting the films across. But I think it would be a shame that this is the way that films are seen now, on these little platforms and things like that. So it's important to get the films in cinemas. That's very difficult to get audiences to come to, because they're paying for a one-off experience in a cinema, and they're very used to what they think or expect that cinema experience to be. So it's very difficult to get your films shown, I agree, but I would go the festival route, quite frankly. festivals like Master of Arts. I would just get the films in front of people, and then it's interesting. Even though you might not get a lot of people coming to see the film, you meet other people, you meet other directors, you meet other distributors, and if someone really clicks with your film, you form a relationship with other people. And I think relationships and networks are very important in the film world. It's very important that that is developed, and as much as you can do that, I think that's the best way to go. I mean, when I started as an artist, I was a painter, and then moved into digital arts, and so I have a broad appreciation of what I think is good art. For me, it comes down to experience. If you stand in front of a painting and you have this overwhelming experience, and you stand there and you engage and you look and there's something about that piece of work that speaks to you, that's good art. If I go to a performance and I'm moved to tears, or I'm moved, it touches me, it touches your soul, it speaks about something, it leaves you with a thought process. It leaves you with a thinking about the world slightly different. I think that is good art.